My father got me and my brother interested in hunting at a young age. He would take us out squirrel hunting, but then over the years, we got old enough, he took us deer hunting, but in this part of the state, we didn't have any seasons up here, so we had to go down in southern Illinois. Then over the years, my passion and my love for finding deer antlers was my top priority. Over the years, I had friends that wanted me to come and go fishing and do other things, but my time for shed hunting was what I was really interested in. Then over the years, after I got time to and retired, I got into turkey hunting, and my life just changed. That sometimes I just don't feel I want to kill the deer as much as I love to find the deer antler sheds. And Don has been a true friend all these years with me, and I really appreciate that. And it just keeps growing every day. His knowledge and his insights of being able to understand and learn about these deer just encourages me to even go out and hunt for these deer sheds.
You know, I've often said that the best thing that deer hunting ever did for me was the friends that I made through deer hunting. And I've known my friend Joe Johnson since 1982. We worked together at that time and worked together for 20 years before I left that job. And we just had a lot in common, and the more time we spent around each other, the more our friendship grew. And we had a mutual interest in the outdoors. Now, Joe's interest in deer hunting is just a little bit different than mine. He focuses on finding shed antlers, and you know, he's a guy that'll go out in the spring and he'll cover 8 to 10 miles a day, day after day, as he searches for shed antlers. And my passion is chasing those bucks, you know, the biggest bucks I can find. And back in the spring of 2018, Joe stopped by my house to show me some of the sheds he'd found that spring, and he showed me one particular set that at the time, I thought it was probably off of a 3-year-old buck. But it was a set of antlers that showed a lot of potential. You know, there were some forked tines and extra sticker points and such, and I thought, here's a buck that has the potential to be really special.
Well, it's usually in first part of February, sometimes the last weeks or so of January, I start getting out, and what I love to do is find where these deer spend their winter time and around their food source. If you can find that, you always have a better chance of finding it. And I just happened to find a piece of property, and I was out there one day, and actually I just had got out of my truck and just had started going down a lane, and it was probably 200-300 yards away. I could see this thing was sticking up out in a bean stubble field. And I always carry binoculars with me, so I got my binoculars out. And sure enough, I could tell from that distance that it was a deer antler shed. And so I kept walking, and I finally got back there, and whenever I got close enough, it was one of those wow moments of this is more than just a deer antler shed. This was a super shed. So I looked and looked around, couldn't find the other side. But I knew that with all the food source that was there, that this deer probably spent a lot of time around there, and I had a chance. So I combed that bean stubble field, couldn't find it. Looked on the edges, because that's where I love to look for deer antler sheds, is around the edges. And but there was about 25 acres on this same farm that was in corn stalks. They hadn't worked them in the fall or anything. And the food out there was just crazy too. And so I made my mind up that I was gonna look row after row on this about 25 acres. And I would take about 3 or 4 rows and just start walking down. And I just had made my first pass down and was coming back, and sure enough, here laid the other side. This matching set had not been chewed on, and just was amazing. And so in the process, you know, I keep looking for sheds, and you know, a week or so later, I bring him over and I get a hold of Don and bring him to him, and we were both amazed at the time. You know, this is a good deer. And at that time, you know, we thought, you know, he's a young type deer. I mean, he's 3-4 years old at that time. Had lots of potential. He could be something, because he already was.
I took that info and went to Google Earth on my computer, and I just looked the aerial over of that whole area, and I tried to think of, if I was a mature buck, you know, where would I go in that area to survive? It's an area that has a lot of hunting pressure. And this buck, I knew he had found somewhere in that area to hide when the pressure's on, and survived. And I was just looking at that Google Earth, trying to hone in on that exact location where that buck might have lived. And I really focused on 2 different properties. Each one had a very small chunk of cover on it. The total cover was probably 3 acres or less on each property, or right around 3 acres. And so I sought to get permission on those 2 properties to basically to start out just to hang some trail cameras to see if that buck was indeed there. And you know, I knew the odds of me getting hunting permission was going to be pretty slim in that area. It's an area that's heavily hunted, and basically any place that hunting's allowed, there's somebody there. But I knocked on the 2 doors one summer day, and lo and behold, I ended up getting permission on both the properties. But I still didn't know that buck used those properties. So in mid-July, I went out one morning and I hung my trail cameras on each property. And about 6 weeks later, I came back to change the cards and check those cameras, and got those cards home and stuck the first one in the computer, and I was absolutely amazed. The very first picture that popped up was the buck I was looking for. And it was taken in midday, just a few hours after I'd been there that morning and put the camera out. And that buck had smelled where I'd walked in to put that camera up, and he stayed in front of that camera for quite a little bit. And I got about 15 or 20 pictures of him at every angle you could possibly imagine as he was checking out where I'd come in that morning. And they ended up getting pictures of that buck on both properties. So I was really excited about that. So once I knew that buck utilized these 2 properties where I had permission, it was time to put together a plan to kill that buck at some point down the road. And I immediately started really scouring Google Earth, those particular thickets where I had permission, and how that buck was probably utilizing those, how he was entering and exiting those thickets. And that summer I went ahead and I got a tree stand ready on each property. But that fall, when hunting season rolled around, I had bigger bucks to chase. The buck really hadn't put on too many inches from the previous year, so I didn't focus on him too much. I focused on some other bucks, but I did have those stands in place. I did not hunt him a single time. I never went in and hunted either stand, even though I had permission to do so. The stands were in place. I was kind of biding my time. I left my cameras on those properties all fall and into the winter months to see how that buck was utilizing those properties during hunting season. So the next season, I had a #1 target buck, a 6-year-old buck that was on a totally different property, and I really focused on killing that deer throughout the month of October. And then on November 3rd, I did get that buck shot. And after I shot that buck, I still had 1 buck tag in my home state of Illinois. But I had like 3 or 4 different bucks that were all in the 170 range. And my plan was that I was going to hunt all those bucks based on wind direction. When the wind was right for 1 buck, I'd slip into that area and hunt him. And as the conditions changed, I would just bounce around in the areas where those different bucks lived but I was going to shoot the very first one that gave me an opportunity. Well, as it would happen, the very next day, November 4th, I go in to hunt a different buck than the Joey buck and get a shot and fill the tag, and so I'm done for the season. I've killed bucks on back-to-back days, and the Joey buck again did not get hunted whatsoever, even though I had stands in place for him. So that brings us to the summer of 2020. I get those cameras out again, same places where I'd had them the previous 2 summers, and sure enough, the Joey buck had survived, and I'm getting his picture, and in fact, he had his best rack ever. But I also had my number 1 target buck that year was a buck I called Mel, who scored over 200 inches, and that was the buck I focused on and ended up killing him on October 30th. So once I had him killed, I had my first Illinois buck tag filled, and it's time to work on filling the second one. Well, the Joey buck was certainly on my hit list, and but I felt like I needed some specific conditions to kill that deer. These pockets of cover where I was hunting him were so small that I thought I needed some hunting pressure to push that buck into the thickets where I had permission. And also my previous year's trail camera history had shown me that while Joey summered on those properties where I had permission, soon after shedding velvet, he would disperse and go elsewhere, and I would not get his picture very consistently. He was moving off, but he was coming back from time to time, and I'm sure it was mainly during the rut, and I'm sure he was coming back to look for does. So I needed a couple of different conditions to really have a chance at the Joey buck, or so I thought. I needed some hunting pressure to push him in there, and it needed to be during the rut. So, 2 days after our Illinois gun season in November, on November 24th, the conditions were perfect. We just had gun season to push Joey into one of these little thickets, and I had the perfect wind condition to hunt one of these stands. So I went out, and where I had my stand, it was really thick. It was in a thicket I had a ladder stand in that thicket, and I didn't even use the bottom section of the ladder stand. The stand was only about 10 feet off the ground. If I would have went up all the way, it was so thick I would have never got a shot, but I kept my stand low. I was in a real gnarly hedge tree, and about 12 yards away was the trail where I expected Joey to come past. But I had one shooting lane in that thicket, and there was about a 10-foot section of trail where that buck was going to pass that I could shoot. And if I didn't get him shot in that 10-foot section of trail, I was not going to have a shot besides that. So, that morning when I went in to get in my stand, I knew I needed to do something to stop that buck right in that 10-foot section of trail. So I took in a bottle of Smoky's Doe and Heat scent, and before I climbed into my stand, I went over to the trail, and right where I wanted that buck to stop, I just poured that scent out, the entire bottle, 4-ounce bottle. I splashed it on the tree branches and just all over the place. I wanted to make sure that buck smelled it when he come through, if he in fact did come through. So I climbed back in my stand, and I hadn't been in there, this is right at daylight. It had rained the night before, and the rain had just stopped about daylight, so I sit in my truck as long as I could to keep from getting wet, and by the time I got into my stand, it was getting shooting light. And I climbed up there, and about 15 minutes later, I look up through the tree branches off to my left, and I could see a buck coming, but I couldn't tell what buck it was, and I just kept looking, and that buck passed through an opening in the tree branches, and when he did, I could see that forked G2 tine on one side. And when I seen that, I knew that was Joey. He was coming right at me just like he should. And he was doing everything a big buck should to stay alive. He was playing the wind to his advantage, but I was just where he was getting ready to hit my wind, but then he was turned on the trail that I was covering right before he hit my wind. And when he did that, he was coming through that thicket with the wind right in his nose. I just happened to be off to the right side where he couldn't smell me. And I'd already had my release on my bowstring, and I had my bow up, and I'm just waiting for that buck to come into that opening. And I seen him coming, 10 feet before he's going to hit this opening, he walks behind this deadfall. And when he did, I drew. And as he steps into that opening, he smells that smoky scent and he locks up. And when he did, it was too late because I already had the pin on his chest and I released. And the arrow hit home and he didn't go anywhere and piled up. And you know, it was so amazing about this story is that I'd followed this buck for 2 years. My friend Joe had sets of shed antlers from him from the previous 3 seasons. And my first hunt, 15 minutes into my first hunt for that deer, I put an arrow through him. And as I think back how everything fell into place, it's almost like God had destined me to shoot that buck. You know, my friend Joe found both of those sheds that first year, really got me excited. I went to get permission on the 2 properties where I thought that buck was probably spending some time, and 2 properties that I didn't even really think I would get permission to hunt, and yet I did. I got permission for both of them. I put those cameras out the first summer. The first deer that's on the card is the buck I'm after. And then I go in on my first hunt, 15 minutes into my first hunt, I put an arrow through Joey. You know, one thing the Joey buck did, Joey's one of my top 5 bucks now, and he bumped that average up a little bit of what those top 5 bucks average. But one thing I want to throw out there is that people seem to think that I have a special farm that's, you know, hundreds of acres, and it's a whitetail paradise managed just for these big bucks, and that's where I kill them all. You know, the fact of the matter is, of my top 5 bucks, 2 of them were killed on my 120 acres. The other 3 were killed on properties where I just knocked on doors for permission. I didn't pay a dime as far as a lease fee. There was no food plots on the property, no management whatsoever on the property. I mean, they were real world bucks in every sense of the word. They were in heavily hunted areas, you know, where other hunters were after these same bucks. And, you know, I just don't want people to think that they can't relate to me. I'm just a simple country boy. God didn't make me any better than he made you or anyone else. I'm just chasing my passion. And I just wanted to kind of clear the air a little bit that all these bucks I'm shooting are not coming from a property that's hundreds of acres, that's, you know, been managed just for these deer. 3 of my top 5 bucks, and includes the Joey buck, were taken on properties where absolutely nothing was done. All I did was knock on doors to get permission, and sometimes I get turned down when I knock on doors, just like everyone else. So I just kind of wanted to clear the air a little bit on that. So there's a really interesting fact about my top 5 bucks. I just finished my 43rd deer hunting season. I've been hunting 43 years, and 4 of my top 5 bucks have been killed in the last 4 seasons. And today I'm actually spending less time in a tree hunting than I ever have, and yet I'm killing the best bucks of my life. And it really comes down to preparation. And the Joey buck is a perfect example of that. You know, I spent 15 minutes hunting for that deer, 15 minutes, but I spent over 2 years preparing for that 15 minutes. You know, on my podcast, I'm always talking about discipline. You know, discipline is what sets those guys apart that consistently kill big deer from those that just want to. And it takes a lot of discipline to know where there's a buck like Joey living, and yet for 2 seasons you don't go in and hunt him. That's the type of discipline that it takes to kill these kind of deers, these kind of bucks year after year. You got to know when the time's right, when the conditions are right, when the wind's right, when the weather's right, when the time of the season's right, when your stand's in the right location. And when all those things line up, you know it's time. Let's get in there and let's get it done. And it don't always fall into place in 15 minutes. But I've got to the place in my hunting career after 43 years when I can recognize when all those things are lined up for a particular buck. And again, the last 4 years, I've killed 4 of my top 5 bucks. And I'm hoping I'm not done. Who knows, maybe I am. But the Joey buck just serves as a perfect example of the way I hunt today. You know, I get a lot of deer hunters reaching out to me for advice on how they too can kill bucks like this. And I believe everyone can. I'm not special. God didn't make me any smarter or any better than anyone else. But you got to remember, I'm looking at 43 years of experience when I head to the woods. You know, a guy with half my experience, with 20 years experience, you know, he's considered a veteran. And yet that veteran doesn't have half the experience or time in the woods that I do. So, you know, I just encourage everybody to continue to grow and become better deer hunters. You know, one of my goals every season is I want to end that season as a better deer hunter than when I started. I want to pick up just a little bit more knowledge so that the next season I'm starting off just a little bit better than I started off this year. And that's really my advice to everyone watching this video is don't think that you can just instantly start shooting the bucks that someone with over 40 years of experience is shooting. Work to get to that point, but it's going to take some time. So I want to end this video with just thanking everyone that's watching. You know, my deer hunting success has gone to a new level in recent years, but it's only because of you that I've been able to share that and, you know, make it my living. I'm totally booked full this winter with my consulting. My whitetail master class is full. We got the Chasing Giants Film School coming up. We've already got students for both of those. The YouTube channel is just getting more and more subscribers. Just returned from a show in Ohio where I spoke with hundreds, if not thousands of people over the weekend. And they all had nothing but positive things to say about the Chasing Giants podcast. And I just want to thank everyone from the bottom of my heart, you know, for supporting me, supporting the channel, the YouTube channel, the podcast, whatever. Because of your support, it's all possible. So thank you.